Welcome to Stories from the NNI. This series features voices from the U.S. National Nanotechnology Initiative. I'm Lisa Friedersdorf, Director of the National Nanotechnology Coordination Office. In this episode, I continue my conversation with Paul Westerhoff, Deputy Director of the National Science Foundation-supported NanoSystems Engineering Research Center for NanoEnabled Water Treatment Technologies, NEWT for short. He shares what he's learned from collaborating across disciplines and how his thoughts about nanotechnology have evolved over time. You mentioned the center in a number of the folks that you're engaged with across these universities. It seems like your work is very interdisciplinary. Could you talk a little bit about working across disciplines to solve big problems?
Yeah, so within this center for sure, and I have another project that's funded by the US EPA, but we've been able to, especially around this topic of environmental health and safety of nanomaterials, you really need to bring a lot of people together to either solve or identify problems, but also develop new technologies. We've been fortunate to work together with different disciplines, not just within engineering, like environmental engineers, chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, actually some aerospace engineers as well, and chemical engineers, but also other physical sciences. We work closely with people in everything from cell biology to botany, chemistry, geology, material sciences. But I think some of the most exciting personal learning on my end has really come from working with social scientists and groups of people who try to figure out how to tell stories. These are people at our universities, but also I do quite a bit of work with different NGOs, and they ask very interesting questions. Some of the people we work with do surveys, and so we've been conducting surveys as part of our center to understand what are the barriers for implementing nano-enabled devices from an industry perspective. So the partners we have in industry, they'll feel stress above them and below them. Above them is a vice president maybe saying, well, is it going to cost too much to use nanotechnology? Do we have to change our safety within our manufacturing process? Is this a high risk, or is it going to take 10 years to get something through a regulatory process to use? And then kind of below them are the workers, manufacturers who are going to be putting together these parts and wanting to know, what do I do with my waste streams? And so by talking to that group of stakeholders, you get one set of questions, and they have questions about the perception of the public around the products they're trying to make. Should they tell them it has nanotechnology? Is nano something that's going to slow down technology development? So on an industry side, there's stakeholders, and talking with them in surveys and informal focus groups have been really interesting. And then also the general public. When you ask someone a very simple question, would you feel comfortable drinking out of a water bottle that had nanoparticles in it? And the first look is, well, I don't know what nano is. Only about a third of the people we talked to actually had any understanding of what nano was. And then in the end, they pretty much brought it down to two things: what is a water bottle, or a device that treated their water. And they said, well, if it has some type of public-private partnership seal of approval, we'd accept that it would be safe to use, and that, oh, by the way, it better cost less, or for the same amount of money, do more. And so, that's really kind of interesting as an engineer, and we have graduate students, working in our labs, and as they are engaged with understanding and seeing these questions, it really changes the type of research that they do to be sure that they're really addressing all these different stakeholders. The other really cool group of people, interdisciplinary, setting we've been able to work with on an EPA project I have, is with people who design museum exhibits. We've had a research project going on with 9 universities. They've been involved from the beginning, this group of a museum exhibit. And so we've worked together, we prototyped, we had focus groups, and now we just set out 100 kits to 100 different museums around the country. And it's going to be looking at nanoparticles that people use and experience every day in their life, and how they make choices between products that might have nanomaterials in them versus chemicals. And a really good example would be sunscreen. You go to the store today, About 50% of the sunscreens will have organic chemicals sunblock in it, and about 50% will have nanoparticle sunblock in it. And it's really interesting to see how people make those choices and whether nanotechnology is at all one of their considerations, or is it really some of the benefits that nano-enabled products have. We've done very similar things thinking about water with different customers as well. I would have no idea how to design a museum exhibit, and it was really through these other NNI activities across different agencies that we've been able to connect to and make 1 + 1 far more than 2.
Oh, that's great. And we just love examples of that. Could you talk to us a little bit about, you've mentioned a couple of examples, you've talked about some funding agencies, but could you talk a little bit about how you've interacted with the U.S. National Nanotechnology Initiative?
Right, so I've interacted with the NNI in kind of 2 or 3 ways. One of them, of course, I've been fortunate to submit and get funding from the National Science Foundation, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institute of Health, and Department of Energy around nano for identifying some of the challenges we talked about. I've served on various panels, USDA, NSF, and other panels for both research proposals as well as SBIRs for small business. And some of those are really interesting because they bring together people from such diverse backgrounds that the panels themselves are very insightful for me to learn from. So that's kind of the funding part. I've also been fortunate of working with what's called a community of researchers that spans from the US to Europe. I'm the US co-chair of one of these community of researchers related to nanomaterial exposure as it relates to environmental health and safety topics of both humans and ecosystems. And so here, prominent researchers in the US and EU get together infrequently, about once a year. We communicate more throughout the year to share ideas, strategies that are going on in 2 different continents around nanotechnology and some of the differences and the different approaches that these groups take in working with industry and regulators as nanotechnology moves forward. So that's been really exciting to be kind of part of this knowledge sharing across different countries. So those are a few ways that my group has worked with the NNI.
Those are all great examples. Thank you very much. Are there any other parting thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think kind of where I started, and I'd like to maybe close, is that my thinking of nanotechnology has advanced a lot over the last 10 to 15 years, from thinking that nanotechnology might pose risks to humans and ecosystems. I've really now kind of thought about how that transitions, that how we can easily manage those risks, but also to use nanotechnology for what I think is one of the forms that you need to have the most purity or the most safety, that nanomaterials would not cause harm, but to actually use it to purify drinking water. In the environmental world, as things move closer to the mouth, people get more scared about them. If I have a contaminant that's buried underground, people don't really worry too much. When they put it on their skin, they're kind of worried. When you put it on lipstick, they get more worried. When it's something you're eating every day or feeding to your children, people get a lot more worried about that intentional consumption. And we all need water. The idea of this balance between purifying water with nanotechnology compared to the risk of a nanoparticle in water, my shifting has changed over the last decade to figuring out how to use nanotechnology for purifying drinking water.
Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to more out of your research centers.
Great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stories from the NNI. If you would like to learn more about nanotechnology, please visit www.nano.gov and check back here for more stories.